a pack of German Shepherd canine puppies, abandoned and desperate, runs up to a soldier begging for help. But what he discovers when he follows them will leave you speechless. Stay until the end to witness a shocking truth that changes everything. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe, like this video, and turn on notifications. Your support helps us bring more incredible stories like this. The early morning sun cast a golden glow over the vast military training grounds. Sergeant Daniel Carter had just finished his routine jog when something unusual caught his eye near the perimeter fence. At first, he thought it was just a trick of the light, the way shadows played across the dusty terrain. But then, he saw them. A group of German Shepherd puppies, no older than a few weeks, huddled together near the fence line. Their small bodies trembled, their fur matted with dirt, and their eyes beamed with something that sent a chill down his spine: fear. Daniel had spent years in combat zones, had faced dangers most men could only imagine. But this? A pack of abandoned canine puppies acting this way? It didn't make sense. As he took a cautious step forward, one of the pups, the largest of the group, whimpered and darted toward him, its tiny paws kicking up dust. The others followed, yelping and barking frantically, as if trying to tell him something. Daniel crouched down, scanning them for injuries. "Easy, little guy," he muttered, reaching out a hand. The lead pup, a black and tan male with striking blue eyes, nudged his palm with its nose before immediately turning and running back toward the trees. Then it stopped. It looked back at him, and it barked. It wasn't just a random bark. It was sharp, urgent, a call for action. Daniel frowned. He wasn't a canine handler, but he had seen enough military working dogs to recognize when something was wrong. The other puppies followed the first one, all glancing back at him as if begging him to follow. A strange unease settled in his chest. Something about this wasn't right. Daniel hesitated for only a moment before instinct kicked in. He followed them. They led him through the perimeter fence and into the woods beyond the base. The terrain became rougher, the thick trees creating long shadows despite the rising sun. The puppies moved fast, their tiny bodies zigzagging through the underbrush, never slowing, never hesitating. Daniel picked up his pace, his pulse quickening. He had been on countless search and rescue missions, but this was different. What were they leading him to? Then suddenly, the barking stopped. The puppies froze at the edge of a small clearing, their ears flattened, their bodies low to the ground. Daniel's gut twisted. Slowly, he stepped forward, pushing aside the thick branches. And then he saw it. His breath caught in his throat. Lying motionless on the ground, partially hidden beneath a pile of leaves, was a fully grown canine German Shepherd. Its body was still, too still. Daniel's heart pounded. This wasn't just an abandoned dog. This was a trained military canine, and it wasn't alone. Just a few feet away, something else glinted in the dirt. Daniel stepped closer, then froze. His blood turned to ice. Bullet casings scattered across the ground. Someone had been here, someone had shot this dog, and if the puppies had come running to him for help, then whoever did this might still be nearby. Daniel wasn't alone, and whatever was happening here, it was far from over. Daniel's pulse pounded in his ears as he crouched beside the fallen canine, scanning the dense forest for any signs of movement. The puppies huddled behind him, their small bodies trembling, their whimpers the only sound breaking the heavy silence. He reached out carefully, pressing 2 fingers against the adult German Shepherd's motionless body. His breath caught. The dog was still alive, barely. Daniel's hands moved on instinct, checking for wounds. Blood matted the thick, black and tan fur near its shoulder, the stain dark and fresh. A gunshot wound. His training kicked in. Control the bleeding first. He ripped off a piece of his undershirt, pressing it firmly against the wound, trying to slow the blood loss. The dog stirred, a weak whimper escaping its throat. Its eyes fluttered open, deep brown, filled with pain. And something else, recognition. This canine wasn't just any dog. It was trained. A soldier in its own right. Daniel felt a lump form in his throat. Someone had left this dog here to die. Someone had shot it, but why? His eyes flickered back to the bullet casings on the ground. His gut told him this wasn't a random act of cruelty. This was something else, something deliberate. He scanned the area again, instincts screaming at him. If there was gunfire, someone must have heard it. Someone could still be out here, watching. The puppies huddled closer against his leg, their tiny bodies pressing into him for comfort. The largest one, the same pup that had first led him here, let out a low, warning growl. A snap of a twig. Daniel's grip tightened around his sidearm. He wasn't alone. He moved fast, scooping the injured canine into his arms. The dog let out a sharp whine, but there was no time to be gentle. "Come on, pups," he whispered, backing away toward the tree line. "We need to move. Now." The journey back was slower. The weight of the injured canine slowed Daniel down, but he didn't dare stop. The puppies trailed close, their tiny legs struggling to keep up, but their fear kept them moving. His mind raced with questions. Who shot this dog? Where was its handler? Why were the puppies left behind? And the biggest question of all, what was this canine involved in before it was attacked? Daniel had worked with military canine units before. These dogs weren't just pets, they were highly trained, used in some of the most dangerous missions imaginable. If this one had been left for dead, it wasn't an accident. It was a message. The realization sent a chill down his spine. By the time Daniel reached the perimeter fence of the base, his arms were burning, his legs aching. But he didn't stop. A guard at the checkpoint spotted him, and his eyes widened. "Sergeant Carter?" He rushed forward. "Sir, what happened?" "Get a medic. Now." Daniel's voice was sharp, urgent. "This dog's been shot. I need a vet, and I need someone to run a trace on its service tag." The guard hesitated for only a second before nodding and barking orders into his radio. Within moments, several soldiers ran toward them, medics and canine handlers among them. A handler, a woman with a crisp uniform and a sharp gaze, knelt beside Daniel as he carefully lowered the wounded canine to the ground. "Where did you find him?" she asked, already checking the dog's vitals. Daniel wiped the sweat from his brow. "In the woods, just beyond the fence." Her hands froze. She looked up at him, her face suddenly pale. "The woods?" she repeated, as if he had just told her something impossible. Daniel narrowed his eyes. "Yeah. Why?" She swallowed hard. "Because if this is who I think it is, that dog was reported KIA over a month ago." Daniel felt his stomach drop. Killed in action? That wasn't possible. The dog lying in front of them, the same one that had just looked into his eyes, recognizing him as someone who could help, was supposed to be dead. And if it wasn't, then someone had lied. Daniel's breath hitched as the handler's words echoed in his mind. Killed in action? A month ago? That didn't add up. Not with the fresh bullet wound, not with the sheer terror in the puppy's eyes when they ran to him for help. He clenched his fists, forcing himself to stay calm. "You're telling me this dog was declared dead?" The handler, still crouched beside the injured German Shepherd, hesitated before nodding. K9 Shadow. He was part of a high-risk mission overseas. His unit reported him KIA after an ambush. There was no body recovered. Just his service tag. Daniel's pulse pounded. A military canine doesn't just disappear and resurface a month later with fresh bullet wounds and a litter of puppies clinging to him for survival. Something was very wrong. Shadow let out a weak whimper, his eyes flickering open for a moment. His breathing was shallow, but he was alive, and he had fought to stay that way. Daniel turned to the guard. "Get me everything on Shadow's last deployment. Who was his handler?" The handler, still visibly shaken, swallowed hard. "Sergeant Evan Hayes." Daniel's blood turned cold. Hayes. He knew that name. And not for a good reason. Daniel stood outside the base's intelligence office, arms crossed, his mind racing. Shadow was alive. His handler was missing. And now Daniel was staring at a file that shouldn't exist, one that someone had tried to bury. The reports from the last mission were vague. Too vague. A high-risk operation. A routine patrol that had gone wrong, multiple soldiers injured, and Shadow, reported dead in action. But there was one detail missing from the report. Where was Hayes? Daniel turned the pages, flipping through accounts of soldiers who had returned from that mission. Their statements were contradictory, half of them conflicting with each other. Some said Hayes had gone down in the firefight. Others claimed he had been captured. No one had seen his body. And now his K9 had just shown up, bleeding, with a litter of puppies. Daniel's stomach twisted. He needed answers, and he knew where to start. The medical bay was quiet except for the rhythmic beeping of monitors. Shadow lay on a padded table, his wound bandaged, IVs hooked up to keep him stable. The puppies had curled up beside him, their tiny bodies pressed close, as if refusing to leave his side. Daniel stepped inside, his boots barely making a sound against the tiled floor. He approached the vet on duty, a man in his early 40s who had seen enough combat injuries to know when something didn't add up. "How's he doing?" Daniel asked, keeping his voice low. The vet sighed, rubbing his forehead. "It's a miracle he made it back. He's severely dehydrated, malnourished. And the bullet wound was meant to kill, but it missed anything vital." Daniel's gut clenched. Meant to kill? The vet nodded grimly. Whoever shot him wasn't just trying to stop him. They wanted him gone. Daniel's fists clenched. This wasn't just a wounded K9's returning home. This was an execution attempt. And somehow, Shadow had survived it. The German shepherd stirred, one eye opening slightly, locking on to Daniel. A faint whimper escaped his throat, but his gaze was sharp. Daniel knelt beside him, lowering his voice. "What happened out there, boy?" Shadow's ears twitched, and for a second, it felt like he understood. A flicker of recognition. A memory too deep to reach. But then, a sound outside. Footsteps. Fast. Rushed. Daniel turned just as a soldier burst into the room, his face pale, breath ragged. "Sergeant Carter," he panted. "We found something." Daniel stood immediately. "What?" The soldier hesitated, glancing at Shadow. "It's Hayes." Daniel's heart stopped. "He's alive." Daniel's mind raced as the words sank in. Hayes is alive. For a month, everyone had assumed he was dead, just like Shadow. But now, with the wounded K9 back and a missing soldier suddenly accounted for, everything Daniel thought he knew about this situation had just changed. "Where is he?" Daniel demanded, already moving toward the door. The soldier who had delivered the news hesitated. "He's in bad shape, sir. We found him about 5 miles beyond the perimeter. He was trying to get back to base." Daniel clenched his jaw. "Take me to him. Now." They found Sergeant Evan Hayes in the medical tent, lying on a cot, hooked up to an IV. His face was gaunt, his eyes sunken, and his uniform was torn and caked with mud. But he was alive. Barely. Hayes turned his head slowly as Daniel stepped inside. The look in his eyes was something Daniel had seen before, in soldiers who had survived the impossible, haunted. Daniel pulled up a chair beside him. "Sergeant Hayes," he said, his voice steady. "What the hell happened out there?" Hayes blinked, his breathing uneven. "Carter," he murmured. His voice was weak, like he had been running from something for far too long. He swallowed hard. "You found him." "Shadow." Daniel nodded. "Yeah. But you were declared KIA a month ago, and so was your dog. Hayes let out a bitter, hollow chuckle. Guess someone wanted us dead. Daniel's stomach tightened. Who? Hayes took a shaky breath. His hand trembled as he reached toward the ivy line, but Daniel stopped him, gripping his wrist. Take it easy, Daniel said firmly. Just talk. Hayes's eyes flickered with pain, but also fear. Then, finally, he spoke. We were left behind. Daniel's blood ran cold. Left behind, he repeated. Hayes gave a slow nod. The mission wasn't what they told us. We weren't just on patrol. We were bait. His voice cracked. They knew the ambush was coming, and they let it happen. Daniel sat back, processing the words. Military units were tight. You never left a man behind. If Hayes and Shadow were abandoned on purpose, that meant this went deeper than just a failed mission. Someone had set them up. Why? Daniel pressed. Hayes hesitated, glancing toward the entrance, as if expecting someone to be listening. His voice dropped to a whisper. Because we found something we weren't supposed to. Daniel leaned in. What? Hayes licked his cracked lips. A deal. An arms deal. Local insurgents. Weapons with U.S. serial numbers. Daniel's stomach dropped. Illegal weapons. And if Hayes had proof, that meant someone inside the military had been selling arms to the enemy. Hayes exhaled sharply. They couldn't let us leave. I don't even know how I got away. I just ran. Shadow ran too. His voice broke. I thought they killed him. Daniel's jaw clenched. Shadow had fought against everything to get back home. Those puppies, Daniel said slowly. They're his, aren't they? Hayes nodded weakly. Yeah. He had a mate. One of the local working dogs. His face darkened. They probably killed her. Shadow must have gotten the pups out before they found him. Daniel looked away, his mind racing. This wasn't just about a missing soldier or a wounded canine. This was a cover-up, and someone didn't want the truth to get out. Suddenly, the tent flap rustled. Daniel turned just in time to see a shadow move outside. His instincts flared. They were being watched. Someone knew Hayes was talking. And if they were listening, that meant they were already planning to silence him. The air inside the medical tent felt thick, almost suffocating. Daniel's instincts screamed at him. Someone had been outside listening. He couldn't ignore the sensation crawling up his spine, the way the puppies had tensed, their small bodies pressing against the floor in a silent warning. Hayes looked at him, eyes heavy with exhaustion, but sharp with the same realization. They had been talking too much. And now, someone knew. Daniel didn't waste another second. In a single fluid motion, he grabbed his sidearm and rushed toward the tent entrance. He didn't barge through recklessly. His years in combat had taught him better. Instead, he moved silently, barely disturbing the canvas flap as he stepped outside into the cool night air. The base was quiet. Too quiet. His boots barely made a sound on the dirt path as he scanned the alley between the tents. There was nothing immediately visible, but Daniel knew better than to take things at face value. He crouched low, listening. A few feet away, the faintest shuffle of gravel reached his ears. Someone moving quickly but carefully. Someone who knew how to stay hidden. He turned toward the sound, gun raised. His body moving with an instinct honed over years of experience. But by the time he reached the edge of the tent, the presence was gone. Daniel didn't move for a few seconds, his heartbeat steady, but his mind racing. Someone had been there, listening, calculating. And now, they had disappeared into the night with whatever information they had overheard. He exhaled sharply and turned back toward the tent. Inside, Hayes was already struggling to get up. Don't, Daniel ordered, stepping forward to push him back down onto the cot. You're in no shape to move. Hayes grimaced, but he didn't fight back. You saw them? Daniel shook his head. They were good, knew how to disappear. Hayes cursed under his breath. That means we're out of time. Daniel didn't disagree. Whoever had been eavesdropping wouldn't have been some low-level soldier. This was bigger than them now, and if someone high up wanted this information buried, then Hayes, and anyone helping him, had just been marked as a threat. Daniel glanced at Shadow, who was still resting, but had lifted his head slightly, his deep brown eyes scanning the room as if sensing the shift in tension. The puppies were curled up beside him, their small forms rising and falling with each breath. They had been through so much already, and now they were part of something even bigger. We have to move, Daniel said, his voice low. Hayes let out a tired breath. Where? Daniel already had an answer. He had known the second he realized they were being watched. He had places, locations off the grid, places where he had taken men before when things got too dangerous. He had only used them when absolutely necessary, and right now, this situation was beyond necessary. There's an old safe house, he said. Military outpost, technically abandoned, no active personnel. It's not on any registry and no one should be watching it. Hayes didn't look convinced. You sure about that? Daniel glanced at the tent entrance, then back at Hayes. Nothing is safe anymore, but it's safer than staying here. Hayes ran a hand over his face. Then we don't have a choice. Daniel nodded. No, we don't. Moving Shadow wasn't going to be easy. The dog was still weak, still fighting through his injuries, but there was no alternative. If they left him here, he wouldn't be alive by morning. The same went for the puppies. Daniel made the call. Within 10 minutes, he had secured a private transport, bypassing all the usual base protocols. He knew better than to file for an official transfer. Someone would stop it before it could even be approved. Instead, he kept it quiet, using one of the unmarked Humvees, usually reserved for emergency evacuations. With Hayes barely able to stand on his own, Daniel had to help him into the passenger seat before carefully loading Shadow and the puppies into the back. Shadow let out a low whimper, but his eyes stayed locked onto Daniel's, as if he knew that this was life or death. Once they were on the road, Daniel pushed the Humvee faster than he should have. Every minute they stayed within the base perimeter was a risk. He didn't breathe properly until the dim lights of the base disappeared in the rearview mirror. Only then did he glance at Hayes. You holding up? Hayes smirked weakly. Haven't died yet. Daniel didn't smile. Let's keep it that way. The safe house was nearly 2 hours away, deep into the woods outside the base. The road was rough, barely used, winding through the thick trees that blocked out most of the moonlight. When the cabin finally came into view, Daniel exhaled slowly. It wasn't much to look at, just an old wooden structure reinforced with steel, barely more than a bunker disguised as a rustic retreat. But it was safe, for now. He pulled up and killed the engine. Hayes groaned as he pushed himself upright, wincing. Really went for the scenic route, huh? Daniel ignored him and moved quickly, getting Shadow out first. The dog was exhausted, but still lifted his head as Daniel carried him inside. The puppies followed, their tiny feet barely making a sound on the old wooden floor. Inside, the cabin was cold, the air heavy with dust. Daniel went straight to the communications equipment, switching on a secured frequency. He needed intel, and he knew just the man to call. The line crackled to life a few moments later. Carter? A gruff voice answered. Didn't think I'd hear from you. Daniel didn't waste time. Reyes, I need information. There was a pause. Then, this about the mission? Daniel's grip on the radio tightened. Yeah, and about the people trying to bury it. Another pause. Then, Reyes sighed. You have no idea how deep this goes. Daniel exchanged a glance with Hayes, who was watching him closely. Then tell me, Reyes hesitated. Then, finally, he spoke. There's a leak, Carter. High up. Weapons being moved, deals being made under the table. Your boy Hayes? He found out something that should have stayed buried. Daniel's pulse quickened. Who's behind it? Reyes exhaled. General Morgan. Daniel's blood ran cold. General Morgan wasn't just a high-ranking officer. He was one of the most powerful men in the chain of command. If he was involved, this wasn't just a few bad soldiers sneaking weapons through the system. This was an entire operation. And now, Morgan knew that Hayes was alive, that Shadow had survived, that Daniel was asking questions. They know you're looking, Carter, Reyes continued, and if you're not careful, you'll be the next name on their list. Daniel's jaw clenched. He turned toward the door, scanning the tree line through the cabin window. Everything was still, quiet. But that didn't mean they were alone. Then, a single gunshot. The window shattered. Down! Daniel shouted, diving for cover as bullets ripped through the wooden walls. Hayes hit the ground beside him, his breath ragged. Shadow let out a fierce bark, standing over the puppies protectively. Daniel moved fast, grabbing his rifle and scanning the tree line. 3 men, silencers on their weapons. They weren't here to arrest them. They were here to kill them. Hayes reached for his own weapon, gritting his teeth. Plan? Daniel's mind was already racing. Fight first. Ask questions later. Another shot rang out. Barely missing his head, Daniel took a deep breath. Then, he fired first. And the hunt had officially begun. The gunfire ripped through the cabin, splintering wood and shattering glass. Daniel moved fast, keeping low as bullets tore through the walls. 3 men, silencers on their weapons. These weren't just soldiers. They were hitmen. Trained, precise, sent here to end this. Hayes was on the floor, blood seeping through the bandages on his side. He'd already been too weak to move much, and now, with the impact of diving out of the line of fire, he looked even worse. But his hands were steady as he loaded his rifle, his expression grim. Shadow let out a low warning growl, standing in front of the puppies, his body tense despite his injury. The tiny pups whimpered, pressing against him, their instincts telling them that something was very wrong. Daniel exhaled slowly. Focus, prioritize, execute. First step, survive. Daniel peeked through the broken window, his eyes scanning the tree line. The men were moving, fast, tactical, flanking them. If he didn't act now, they'd be boxed in. He turned to Hayes. Can you shoot? Hayes gritted his teeth. Like hell I can't. Daniel smirked. That's what he needed to hear. He pressed his back against the wall, gripping his sidearm. His rifle was still strapped to his back, but there wasn't time to grab it now. Close-range combat. He had to get them inside. One of the men made a mistake, stepping too far out of cover. Daniel fired once. A single, precise shot. The man dropped instantly. A muffled grunt. The only sound before he crumpled into the dirt. That was all it took to disrupt their formation. Hayes took the chance, pulling himself up just enough to get one shot off. It wasn't as clean as Daniel's, but it still hit. One of the shooters staggered back, injured but still alive. The third one? He didn't hesitate. He opened fire. Daniel barely had time to react. He grabbed Hayes by the vest and pulled him down hard. Bullets shredded through the cabin's entrance. The force of it knocked the breath out of both of them, dust and wood splinters flying everywhere. Shadow lunged forward, barking viciously, his teeth bared. But Daniel held him back. Shadow was trained to fight, but not like this. Not against guns. Daniel turned his head, scanning their surroundings. No way out from here. If they ran, they'd be picked off before they even made it past the porch. Which meant they had to flip the ambush. Daniel looked at Hayes. "You trust me?" Hayes let out a weak chuckle. "A little late to ask that, don't you think?" Daniel smirked. Then he reached into his belt and pulled out a smoke grenade. Hayes' eyes widened. "Where the hell were you hiding that?" Daniel didn't answer. Instead, he pulled the pin. The entire cabin filled with thick, choking smoke. That was their window. Daniel moved first, grabbing his rifle and launching himself toward the door. The shooters outside hesitated. The smoke had disrupted their visibility, and in combat, a second of hesitation meant everything. Daniel took the shot. The injured man went down, one left, and then the final shooter made his move. He lunged forward, trying to rush through the smoke and into the cabin. Bad mistake. Shadow was waiting. Before the man could even react, the wounded canine launched forward, teeth sinking deep into his arm. A scream ripped through the night as Shadow dragged the man down, his powerful jaws clamping tighter. Daniel stepped forward, gun raised. "Call them off. Now." The shooter panted, pain flashing across his face, but he smirked, defiant. "You don't get it, do you?" the man hissed. "Morgan's already won. You can kill me, but it won't change a damn thing." Daniel clenched his jaw. "You think so?" The shooter's smirk wavered. Daniel nodded toward Hayes, who was still bleeding, but very much alive. "Your people left him to die. They left his canine to die. But guess what?" He motioned toward the puppies. "They lived. And now, we know everything." The shooter's expression finally changed. Fear. Because he knew. The plan had failed. They weren't supposed to make it out. Daniel took a slow breath, steadying his gun. "Who else is in on it?" The shooter's jaw tightened. "Go to hell." Daniel didn't hesitate. He fired once. The man dropped. Silence fell over the cabin. Smoke still hung in the air, but it was over. Daniel turned to Shadow, who had let go, his injured body trembling with exhaustion. Daniel knelt beside him, running a hand over his fur. "Good boy." Shadow let out a weak whimper, then collapsed against Daniel's leg. Daniel exhaled slowly. They had won this fight. But the war? That was just beginning. The dust had barely settled. The air inside the cabin was still thick with smoke, the smell of gunpowder lingering in the cold night. Daniel took a slow, deep breath, his gun still warm in his hands. The last shooter lay motionless on the floor. The fight was over. For now. Hayes groaned beside him, clutching his side as he tried to sit up. His face was pale, but his eyes were sharp, determined. "Carter," he muttered, his voice hoarse. "Tell me we're still alive." Daniel exhaled. "Barely." Shadow, the wounded canine who had survived against all odds, was still breathing, but he was weak. The puppies were nestled around him, their small bodies rising and falling with exhaustion. They had no idea how close they had all come to being wiped out. Daniel holstered his weapon and pulled his radio from his belt. The secure frequency was still open, static humming in his ear. He pressed down the button. "Reyes, it's done." A beat of silence. Then, "You're still breathing?" "Damn. I owe someone $20. Daniel's lip twitched, but there was no humor in his voice when he answered. "We need extraction. Now." Reyes's tone shifted immediately. Serious, calculated. "I'm on it. But listen to me, Carter. This isn't over." Daniel already knew that. General Morgan had sent killers after them, had ordered Hayes and Shadow to be erased, had tried to cover up a military arms deal gone bad. And now he knew that Daniel wasn't dead, which meant Morgan wouldn't stop. Daniel glanced at the bodies on the floor. The men sent to finish the job hadn't been sloppy. They were trained professionals. That meant Morgan was getting desperate. He wasn't just trying to cover his tracks anymore. He was trying to burn them. Daniel took a slow breath. "What's our play?" Reyes hesitated. "I can get you out, but you know what that means." Daniel did. If Reyes pulled them, it wouldn't be for protection. It would be to take the fight to Morgan. A direct hit. A mission to end this for good. Daniel turned to Hayes. "You in?" Hayes let out a breathless laugh, wincing as he moved. "Do I have a choice?" Daniel smirked. "Nope." Hayes exhaled. "Then, yeah, I'm in." Shadow let out a faint whimper, shifting slightly. Even in his weakened state, his eyes were alert. Watching, protecting. Daniel reached out, running a hand over the canine's fur. "You up for one more fight, Ba?" Shadow didn't move at first. Then, slowly, his tail thumped once against the floor. Daniel smiled. "That's what I thought." 12 hours later. The black SUV rumbled through the night, headlights slicing through the dense forest. The road ahead was long and uncertain, but the mission was clear now. They weren't running anymore. Morgan thought he had control, thought he could silence the truth. But he had underestimated a soldier, a survivor, and a canine who refused to die. Daniel tightened his grip on the wheel, eyes locked on the road ahead. Morgan was about to learn the hard way. Some battles you can't win. The end. For now. If this story kept you on the edge of your seat, hit like, subscribe, and let us know in the comments. Should Daniel, Hayes, and Shadow take down Morgan in a sequel? We want to hear from you.